soldiers used their cannons to tear great big holes in the Jacobite lines and finally the Highlanders charged. Now back to this painting. We're in, of course, a lovely gallery here in the house, but this painting hangs in Buckingham Palace. There's a little story behind it. It was done by a man called David Moria, and Moria was employed by King George to do a picture of the Battle of Culloden. What many people don't realise is the Highlanders in this picture are actually prisoners who were captured on the battlefield. So these are real men that fought in the battle who were told to stand there and pose while the artist painted them. So it's almost like a photograph of the men who were involved in the conflict. And if you blow one of the faces up, you see he's got rather a bit of stubble, here's the looking face. But the thing about the Highlander that strikes you, which you may not know straight away, is he's not actually full bearded. Because in the 18th century, it was not the fashion to have a beard. This is very much a 17th century thing. So yesterday, yeah. So in the 18th century, many Highlanders used to shave and tie their hair into a ponytail, and that was the fashion at the time. So the image of the bearded Highlander didn't really apply to the 45 and running Prince Charlie's time. So the Redcoat soldiers finally defeat the clans, and after the Battle of Culloden, you're not allowed to wear tartan, carry weapons, play the bagpipes, or even speak Gaelic. What about these weapons then? Perhaps we should focus on the weapons. Right, now to the common stuff. Let's start with this thing. This is probably the most famous weapon of the Highland clans. It's called a claymore. It comes from the Gaelic. More means big, it's the big sword. A Scottish claymore was used by the Highland clans right up to about 1715. It's a two-handed weapon, which meant you couldn't carry a shield when you went into battle. It was designed in a certain way. The top part was razor sharp, but this part was blunt. The reason it was blunt was if someone tried to strike you with a sword, what you would do is you'd actually grip the blade and use it like a stick to block the blow. The ends were then used to knock the sword over to the side and the pommel to smack him on the nose. Once he landed upon the ground, you whacked him with the sword and that was the job done. But the real question is, how did you carry such a weapon around with you? As you can imagine, you couldn't carry it in a normal sword belt, for it would drag on the ground as you walked along. You couldn't simply pop it on your shoulder like this and walk down the high street of Edinburgh. Somebody might call to you from behind.
Hey,
So you had a thing called a baldric. The best way to describe a baldric was a large piece of leather slipped over the blade with a rope that went around. You slipped the sword into the baldric, you wore it with the blade pointing down. If you were ever attacked, you took it off your back, removed it from the scabbard and used it for the fighting. Unlike a certain gentleman called Mel Gibson. Some years ago, Mel Gibson did a film called Braveheart, which you may have seen. He did get quite a few things wrong in that film, but he did do something quite remarkable that nobody else can do. And it's worth looking out for this if you ever see the film again on television. During one of the battle scenes, you see Mel Gibson with a claymore on his back. But halfway through the scene, he draws the claymore out of the baldric like this. But it is actually physically impossible because your arms would have to be 8 feet long to get the sword out. And it does rule Mr. Gibson out, for he's only about this tall. No, so you have to take the sword off your back and take it out of the scabbard before you could use it. But by 1715, this weapon had virtually disappeared from the Highland weaponry. They'd gone over to the basket broadsword. So let's have a close look at that. Round basket protects your hand. Back guard to save your wrist. On the front are these two small lugs, and they're not for decoration. The idea was to get your opponent's sword to slide down your blade. Trap his sword between these two lugs, and you could twist his sword out of his hand. The basket can also be used to punch him on the nose in a tight fight. The back guard, of course, is saving your wrist. We know a lot about these weapons because of a man called Chevalier de Johnston. He was one of Bonnie Prince Charlie's aide-de-camp, an advisor, and he wrote a book about the Jacobites because he survived the whole campaign. He describes them having a round wooden shield called a targe. It was covered in leather, heavily studded. Behind the targe, he has a long knife called a dirk. Now, he would use these when he attacked his enemy in a three-way fighting motion. Pushes you off balance with the shield, cuts to your body with the dirk, slices you down the middle with the sword, and you fall into 2 bits. Read the last bit up. Yeah. So right up to the Battle of Culloden, these were the weapons the clans were using. The Redcoat soldier at the time used a musket. Now, we'll mention a bit about the musket later on, but I'll show you this one just as it is. Now, the Brown Bess musket was the standard weapon of a British Army foot soldier. It was a difficult thing to load and fire, as I mentioned, so often what he used to do is had to resort to a bayonet. 18 inches of fluted steel that clipped onto the end of the gun like so. Now, right up to the Battle of Culloden, the Redcoat soldiers fighting the Jacobites had found themselves at a disadvantage. So when they tried to stab the Jacobite with the bayonet, he would use the tabs to knock the bayonet to one side and cut towards the body. But at the Battle of Culloden, the Redcoats were taught a little trick. They were told that when the Highlanders attacked them, let's imagine a line of Redcoat soldiers here, they weren't to go for the man facing them, but for the man to the right. The idea was they could use the bayonet to stick the Highlander under the arm who wasn't protected on that side. So the theory was that each soldier could look after the man upon the right-hand side. It sounded great in theory, but in truth it probably didn't work too well on the day of the battle. First of all, the last place you didn't want to be is at the very end of the line, because no one looks after you there. But also lots of these Highlanders were left-handed, and that was a big problem in the battlefield, because the left-handed Highlander shield would be on the side they're trying to thrust. Incidentally, if you do get rather an unpleasant smell, it is in fact the musket, it's not me.